Good morning, Harvey, and welcome to Talking to Thinkers.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, Harvey, maybe if we can start at the beginning of your life. Can you tell us when and where you were born?
March 21, 1932, in New Haven, Connecticut, which is enemy territory for a Harvard man.
What were your parents like?
My father had the same name, Harvey Mansfield. My mother, Grace. She was a musician, published a book on sea chanties of Newfoundland. And my father was a political scientist like me, but he was devoted to American politics, public administration, constitutional law, things like that. They were not religious people rebelling against their parents and became New Deal liberals, one could say. In fact, which was the people who were converted to the Democratic Party by Franklin Roosevelt, who became president the year I was born.
What was it? Was it a bookish intellectual home?
It was for sure. So he was professor at Yale in the 1930s, and then he went to Washington, worked in the Office of Price Administration during World War II. I was there. So I was in Washington, D.C. during the war with the excitement of it, parades. I remember the funeral of FDR towards the end of it. So those were, that was how I lived my youth.
And actually, I mean, during those years, were you then brought up as a good follower of FDR and a liberal or a Democrat?
I was, but not obtrusively, not in any way to impose on my freedom. But yes, I was a liberal politically most of the time through my undergraduate years at Harvard. So it was after that I changed and became conservative.
Okay. Before we maybe come to Harvard, though, maybe if you could tell us a little bit about your pre-university education, what that was like, and what sort of young man you became during those years.
Yes, well, I spent high school in 1 year in Woodrow Wilson High School in Washington, D.C., and then 2 years graduating from North High School in Columbus, Ohio, because my father moved to become a professor of political science at Ohio State University. So that looking back on it, my most valuable courses were 4 years of Latin and 1.5 years course in how to type. That was the most important thing that you needed to know to be a student in those days. A little bit less the case today, but yeah, it was a time when the teachers were intelligent women of a type you see many fewer of in high schools today, where you could say that those women were being exploited because they had no better career to go into than high school teaching, or you could say they were dedicated to service. And this was before there were teachers' unions. So I'm inclined to the latter view. But as I look back on it, it seems better and better. The mathematics was very elementary, much inferior to what you get today. But we studied more Shakespeare, we did more writing, and we learned to admire things.
And were you realizing even during school, high school, that the life of the mind or the life of an intellectual was something that was appealing to you?
I think it was appealing to me, but without my realizing it. I didn't think that this was a special way to live, or that I would be devoting my life to think.
So, what was it behind your? So, moving on to university, you went to Harvard, which was then going to have a huge impact in your life. Um, was Did you just pick Harvard arbitrarily, or was there something more deliberate about that choice?
Um, in between arbitrary and deliberate, I would say. I applied to Harvard and Yale and Swarthmore, a couple of other places. So I had all those choices. But my father just told me that Harvard was a better place. That was his professional judgment of the university as a whole, its reputation. And I had that confirmed from other sources. I didn't visit the place. It was not as easy to visit then as it is now. And Harvard, for its part, was reaching out to students in other parts of the country so that it wouldn't be just furnished by New York and Massachusetts as it had been. So it was looking for me, and I decided on it. Of course, Harvard, when it looks in other parts of the country, tends to look in those places in other parts of the country that most resemble New York and Massachusetts. So they weren't getting a sort of genuine Ohioan in me. They were getting the son of a professor who knew about the Ivy League and so on.
And did you, when you arrived there, did you feel comfortable in the surroundings, or did the place intimidate you?
It didn't exactly intimidate me, but I certainly didn't feel comfortable right away. The students were divided about half and half between those who had been to private prep schools, as we call them, and those who had been to public high schools like me. And the former class tended to be wealthier than I was, the son of a professor. So you could tell. You had to wear a tie and a jacket in those days. It was necessary to wear those two things in order to get into the dining hall. So this was new for me. And whereas it was the usual thing for the prep school kids. And so all in that way, or in those small ways, they fit in more than I did. But still, it was not, it was no problem. It was not difficult. I didn't feel oppressed.
Okay. I mean, it's clear from other interviews you've done that you came under the influence of certain mentors there, professors, and you've mentioned people like Sam Beer,
Yes.
And thinkers who were sympathetic to Leo Strauss. If you want to talk about Samuel Beer and your mentors independent of Leo Strauss, and then maybe we talk maybe about the influence that Strauss's ideas had on you. I know you haven't met him by then.
All right. That's true. I hadn't met Strauss by then. And the one I did meet was Sam Beer, who was not a Straussian, and he was rather bemused when I later became taken with Leo Strauss. He didn't understand that, but he also didn't disapprove either. Well, Sam Beer was the most manly man that I'd met in my life. And I think I would still say that, having written a book on manliness, I dedicated it to Sam Beer. He was my ideal. And I still think he stands without comparison. He used to wear he had been in World War II, had a Bronze Star, an early arrival in Normandy, got trapped behind the German lines. He was a captain of artillery and fought his way out. So he got a medal for that. And he looked as if, behaved as if he deserved it. He wore his military khaki overcoat to class in the winter, strode up and down. He certainly didn't have a militaristic spirit. He came from Ohio, like me, but he had been Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and he became a master of British politics, wrote a book called Modern British Politics, Responsible Government in Britain, which was looked up to by all the British political scientists as the best book on British party politics in that era. And when I graduated, I spent a year in England at the LSE, and he went over to Oxford for a year's sabbatical. So I got to see him over there, and he took me to various wonderful British events. So I went to the convention, annual convention of the Labour Party and of the Conservative Party, both of which were in Margate at that time. And just to say it very quickly, at the Conservative one, I got to hear a speech by Winston Churchill. And at the Labour one, I was bought a drink by an Iron Bevan. Claim that. A very famous Labour politician of the day, perhaps the author of the National Health Service in England. So that was my experience in Harvard and a little bit afterwards.
Just focusing a little bit on that, you say you admired Sam Beer for his manliness, and in your book you talk about different types of manliness. You talk about philosophical manliness, and you talk, it's a multifaceted concept, if you like. I mean, can you elaborate a little bit more on what intellectually impressed you about Sam Beer?
He studied comparative government, or that, and especially Britain, but other governments too, and that's the course that he taught. And he was able to combine that with political theory in a way that comparative political science today is definitely not. Sam Beer was familiar with the word Rousseau in a way that didn't throw him for a loss, as it would most professors today. So this gave a certain dignity and elevation to his teaching, which impressed me as part of the best part of manliness. That someone who looks to be at his best and wants you to be there with him, and looks down on you if you're not. I'd say that would be a combination of his intellectual stature and also of his manliness.
Very good. Well, you obviously did well in your undergraduate years, but shortly after that, you did 2 years military service, which I think at the time was part and parcel of growing up in America. Was that a significant event in your life, or was it just something you wanted to get done and then get back to Harvard to do your studies?
Well, both. I did want to do something else with my life. You're right, I was drafted. I was just about in the last cohort of those drafted who had been to college. For the most part, the military liked to see you before you graduated, before you were 21. So they stopped taking draftees from who had been to college, and this led to a very bad situation later on in the Vietnam War, when that war, and also in Korea, was essentially fought by people who didn't go to college. Ordinary high school grads, or even not that. So that was one thing about the draft at that time. I happened to have a lucky experience, very lucky, because I came in at the end of the Korean War when the fighting had stopped, And instead of sending me to Korea, they sent me to France. And so the US Army Europe, when I arrived, it turned out that was France. And we were in, the American Army was in France until, this was in 1954, 55, until de Gaulle threw us out in 1958 with a very reasonable thought that France could defend itself. But it was a nice place to be. And even though I was an enlisted man, and you're not really in the Army if you're an officer, because to be in the Army is to be bossed around. And so there were a couple of things that stuck with me. One from the Army, and one is I make my bed every day. And I learned that in the Army. It's a certain regularity that discipline is enforced on you, but after a while it gets in you, and it puts you in control, gives you a sense that you're in control of your life, and things that are dirty dishes and unmade beds are not to be tolerated or lived with. And the second thing was that it put me in shape physically. I felt much tougher. I could handle anybody. Small size that I have, I was unafraid. And I think this may have something to do with my, as well as a fortunate nature with my longevity. Because I made it easy for me to feel and what it feels like to be in good shape.
So you eventually returned anyway after serving your draft for 2 years. You go back to Harvard, and you decide to do a PhD, and you choose Edmund Burke as your topic, which culminates in a published book called Statesmanship and Party Government. We can take this in bits, but maybe if you might explain why you chose Burke and what your study of Burke tries to show to someone who doesn't know anything about that.
Right. My book on Burke was on one of his writings called Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents. Came out in 1770. And in that, he produces the first argument that parties or party government is a respectable way for a free society to live. Before that, harmony was the object of, and it was misfortune for a free society to fall into partisanship and faction. So he made it respectable. By respectable means, in his case, that gentlemen could disagree. So it wasn't like the Roman Republic where the nobles were on one side and the plebs on the other, but gentlemen could disagree. Gentlemen that were formed in a party, in parliament, quote, on some particular principle. So it doesn't have to be a true principle, but it has to be a principle. And a principle means something that would keep you from accepting office if it weren't satisfied. So, when that happens, that's party government. So my first chapter in the book makes a distinction between party government and just parties. Parties are everywhere, especially in free societies, but even in unfree ones. But party government was a new invention. It was a new invention of constitutional freedom. And then beyond that, I especially was impressed by Burke's view of prudence and what he called rules of prudence. This is one of the first things that attracted me to Strauss. I was attracted originally to Strauss because I was looking for something that was in between relativism too loose and natural law too strict. And I learned from him that there was this middle thing called prudence. And so it's funny, most people wouldn't say that they were attracted to Strauss because he was prudent or he taught prudence, but I was. And I found that in Burke, and actually Strauss I'd met by then, but encouraged me to write on prudence. So does prudence have rules? That's what Burke proposed in this, or does it depend solely on the individual judgment of the prudent man? And in order to have party government, you have to have a kind of prudence which is open and understandable by people who aren't of the highest intelligence. And so at this time, Burke was in a small party within Parliament around Lord Rockingham. Lord Rockingham was not a great thinker. He was not Burke. But in a way, he was Burke's boss. And Burke made an argument for the elevation of such people over himself. So Burke was perfectly content to work for this guy, this nobleman, because the nobleman had what he called presumptive virtue. He had a certain education and a certain responsibility that had come from being in his family and being wealthy, landed wealth, and having a certain moral education. So he didn't have actual virtue, but he had presumptive virtue. And so Burke made the argument for the ascendancy of presumptive virtue over actual virtue. That virtue needs a certain solidity, which it doesn't have, and on its own, which it lacks. So in very close to Burke's time in Parliament, well, actually when he was there, William Pitt the Younger became Prime Minister of Britain at the age of 24, I think it was. So now that's an example of actual virtue, rising to the top quickly. And the trouble with actual virtue is that it's too susceptible to monarchical influence or to ambition, to put it more directly. So Burke sets an example of a truly first-rate person, first-rate in intellect and you could say in moral virtue too, who was willing not to rise to the top, but to stay where he was. He hoped that he could found a family. So when his son died and removed that hope, he was very upset. But he wasn't going to claim it on his own. So all this goes together with party government, because party government is really, in a way, opposed to statesmanship. And the title of that book could have been Statesmanship versus Party Government. But I put it with and, just to keep it from being the two things so opposed. Statesmanship is doing the best thing in those particular circumstances, requiring judgment, knowledge, especially, and experience. But party government is choosing a principle, some particular principle to stand for. and be willing to accept being out of office if you can't further your principle. So principle, usually when you say someone has principles, what you mean is at the expense of ambition or at the expense of your interest. It's what you would sacrifice your interest or your ambition to get or to support that is your principle. So the principles are good to have and much better than lack of principle, but it's not the best situation when the statesman could have an unlimited discretion, which he, because of his outstanding actual virtue, could be said to deserve.
When you talked about this idea of principles, did you see this as, at the time, as Burke's principles being a kind of proto-conservatism?
Yes,
yes,
yes, it was, right. Of course, as you know, he didn't use that word. He did speak of conserving,
yeah,
conservation and so on. But the political term conservative had not come into use yet. So yes, you're right. Proto-conservative would be the best name for it. Yeah.
And when you finished writing that book and published it, how was it received by the scholarly world?
Well, yeah, I say with perhaps as much respect as I could have expected. There happened to be three of us who were students of Sambeer and produced our dissertation in the same year. And the other two were Melvin Richter and Michael Walzer. Michael Walzer wrote a book that really became famous and got a much greater reception than I did, called The Revolution of the Saints. It was on the Puritans and their politics, the levelers, the saints. And Melvin Richter wrote a book on T.H. Green, the political theorist of late 19th century in England. And they both got prizes and I didn't. So that's I learned what the world is like.
That was quite a distinguished peer group.
Yes.
Well, the good thing was your book got published. For most PhDs don't get published, so that was a good thing to achieve.
True too.
Most of them sit on shelves and gather dust. Anyway, after your PhD, you go to Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley.
Yes.
And you spend 2 years there. And maybe this gives us a chance now to talk about Strauss, because Strauss happened to be in Stanford at the time.
Yes.
You were able to meet him in person on a regular basis.
That's right.
Circle. Maybe if you talk a little about what that was like, being in his presence, and how that maybe solidified his influence on you.
Yeah. He had a reading group that met on Wednesday evening. And it so happened that my teaching schedule gave me a lecture on Wednesday morning and a seminar on Wednesday afternoon. So I had to go from Berkeley to Palo Alto, which is a little over an hour's drive at that time. So I would get in the car after my seminar, not as fresh as I had been at the beginning of the day, and arrived at his place about 8 o'clock, and there to face the most challenging intellectual presence I'd ever met, and still haven't met one before in him. It took all my powers to keep up just with what he was saying. He was so quick and so powerful. And I listened and listened and listened. And if I had a question, he had already answered it, as he pointed out. There were other people there. There were half a dozen of us. That reading group went from 8 till about 12 in the evening, and Mrs. Strauss had decreed that the reading group had to stop at 12 because Leo Strauss had had a heart attack the previous year, and he needed to take it easy. So at 12 o'clock, we all stopped, and then refreshments were served. And he would talk gossip. He loved to talk gossip about his friends and his enemies in the profession. He made jokes. He was a very funny fellow. He loved to make jokes. And then about sort of 2 o'clock, it was time for me to drive an hour back home.
Wow.
Where I arrived pretty exhausted. So that was how it was for that year. He was working on his book on Aristophanes, a book called Socrates and Aristophanes. So we mostly read plays of Aristophanes. I remember the Acharnians was the first one that we started off with, and we also read a dialogue that of Plato, the Laches, which is on courage, which I later used in my book on manliness. Because in Greek, the word for manliness is the same as the word for courage, Andrea. So that was a kind of experience that I had with him, and so that, and it gave me a sense of what a great thinker was. He may not have been a great thinker on the level of the people that he studied. Certainly he himself never claimed to be. He always, if you introduced him as a philosopher, as I once did for the lecture, he rejected that openly as soon as he got to the podium. He said, "I'm not a philosopher, I'm a professor of philosophy." But he was one hell of a professor of philosophy, if that's all he was. So I would put him at least in between ordinary and extraordinary professors of philosophy. I mean, I've known, for example, Van Quine at Harvard is a pretty extraordinary professor of philosophy. And Strauss was way above him. Whether he was up to the level of Machiavelli and Hobbes and Locke, all right, maybe not. But he was there. So it was a personal experience of being with a great mind, or a near great mind, of the highest type, way beyond me. And I spent my life with thinkers that are way beyond me. And I think that's the way to look at it. And I think that's the best kind of intellectual life one can have.
Maybe if we just a little bit more detail on these meetings. Do you recall what other people were there? You mentioned there was 12 people there. Who were the other names that were attending?
Not quite so many, but yeah, maybe haven't. Hillel Gilden, Martin Diamond, Ralph Lerner, Michael Blank. There were a couple of others.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did these, just to give us a sense of how these discussion groups, how they were hosted, did you have a topic or a book? You said you were talking about Aristophanes on Socrates. Yeah. You talk about a theme or a book, and he'd open it up, and he'd open up for discussion. Like how did the mechanics of the conversation occur?
There was an assignment, what we would cover for the next time. And he would cover it line by line. So, and he went so rapidly, but still it was line by line. So it was not, look what's here and look what's there. Kind of a typical political theory experience. But why is this being said right here now? And the general rule was no comparisons ahead. So you couldn't make some remark about something that was coming in the text, but only a comparison backward in the text, so that everybody was sort of equally and at the same point, and nobody was talking about what would come. But students often have that desire to show that they've studied ahead.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was line by line. He showed us just how to read everything that could be learned by reading very carefully from a text. And this was something that he said he had learned from Heidegger in Germany, some Heidegger's seminars on Aristotle. Heidegger was the first philosopher in centuries who was taking Aristotle very seriously as a source of truth, and Strauss was at those seminars in Germany with him, and others too. There were others, Levitt, and I'm forgetting names.
Yeah, no problem.
That he was with. So this is what he showed, and it's the way I've written my later books too, close to the text in that way. They aren't as if they were as good as they would have been if they were written by him, but they were inspired by him.
Very good. I mean, one of the key aspects of Strauss's reading of text is this idea of reading between the lines. The difference between exoteric and esoteric. Yeah. Was that something you bought into from the get-go, or did it take a bit of convincing, or did you actually even accept it?
It took a bit of convincing, but not much. That's the evidence is right there if you look at it. You can make a distinction. This is not one he makes, but one I made between numerological oddities and figurative expressions. Numerological oddities are things, evidences of design, which could not have been accidental. For example, every single one of Machiavelli's books is divided into 13s. The number of chapters in The Prince, the number of speeches in his dialogue, The Art of War, the number of chapters in his longer book, Florentine Histories, and then, as Strauss pointed out, the number of chapters in the Discourses on Livy is the same as the number of books in Livy. That's true. So these are indications that the author has put into his writing something that it takes a while to discover, or it takes a certain ambitious and imagination to see. It's perfectly visible, the prominence of the number 13 in Machiavelli's works, but nobody sees it because nobody thinks that matters or bothers to count. So that tells you that something is up here. Some kind of monkey business is at work. Now then, how do you understand it? And here, this is what I learned is that I learned this from Averroism, and I think this is sort of in Strauss too. By the way, all my discoveries of, as I once said, I discover something which I think is on my own, and then I look at Strauss and I see that he was already there. Yeah. So the Averroists were interpreters of Aristotle in the Middle Ages. Averroes was Muslim, and you see also the Jews, but then there were Christian Averroists too. But Marsilius of Padua, Dante, and recently I was able to see things in Boccaccio. They say that if they're dealing with this problem of revelation versus philosophy. Revelation is sacred, philosophy is intelligible. Sacred means there are mysteries that you can't respond to or can't explain rationally. And so in the Muslim, I have a law, there's a sacred law. And the philosopher comes to this and sees that there is such a law. And he wonders whether philosophy is compatible with it. And if he finds that, say, the Bible or the Quran say the same thing as philosophy does, then there's no problem. But if there's a incompatibility, then the philosopher says the answer is interpretation. You must find some way in which the sacred text can be interpreted to be compatible. So you can understand it as, say, it's composed of stories or fables or parables, as in the Bible, which have a meaning. And so the story has a meaning, the characters have a meaning. So in Machiavelli, he likes to speak of the King of France. What is it that could be understood as a philosophical equivalent for France? France was the home of the French. Machiavelli often speaks of the French. But the French philosophically was the Sorbonne, the scholastic writers. So the scholastic writers could be understood as the French, who were they were a kind of interpreter of Aristotle. And the King of France could be understood as Thomas Aquinas, or maybe God as understood by the scholastics. So this, I'm jumping ahead and offering what won't seem very approachable at first blush, but this is the way that Machiavelli's figures of speech, figurative expressions and figurative stories, the famous one about Cesare Borgia, can be interpreted as philosophical conversations with his predecessors.
Yes, we will come to Machiavelli shortly, but I thought it was interesting there that you mentioned Averroes, because you could see why they may want to indulge in this interpretive game. Because when you think about Aristotelianism in the context of Christianity, there is a straightforward tension there between what, as Aristotle became available, he did constitute a major threat to the authority of the Bible.
Yes.
So you can see therefore why this negotiation would have to happen. Just before we leave this, though, Harvey, because it's not something, this reading of text I'm familiar with, this reading between the lines, if you like. Is it something that once you is it something that you acquire and then you kind of tacitly know, or is there something more rule bound about a Straussian interpretation of a text? I mean, how explicit, implicit is it?
Yes. Well, the Straussian interpretation usually means now reading between the lines. And if you wanted to see some of the evidence for this, you could read a book by Arthur Melzer, former student of mine, who wrote a book called recently, well, not so recently, called Philosophy Between the Lines. Came out. Just all the evidence of the existence of a double understanding or a double interpretation, that writers were able to write politically on one level and philosophically on another level using the same words.
Mhm.
So of course, you have to get, in order to get between the lines, you have to look very carefully at the lines. That's and yeah. So but well, and there are of course many different Straussian interpretations. They disagree, and not all of them. One could even say most of them are probably wrong or inferior, but they're headed in a certain direction.
Okay, very good. I mean, maybe when we talk about Machiavelli, I mean, a word that always strikes me about Machiavelli's political thought is the ambiguity of the word virtue
Yes.
he plays with, and maybe we can talk about that. But anyway, you finish up in Berkeley. You've had those great encounters with Strauss and his circle. You go back to Harvard,
Mm-hmm.
and you basically stay there for the next 60 years. You have your career in Harvard,
Yeah.
and eventually become head of department and then professor. But if we just leave the ivory tower for a moment, and go into the 60s, which was a kind of a defining period in America.
Yes.
Some people thought it as a liberating moment, and in a very positive way. Others saw it as a very troublesome and retrograde decade. I think you saw it in the latter way. You saw it as a negative event. But one of the interesting things you say about it is you say that a lot of liberals who were troubled by the 1960s, because not all liberals of the old, especially the old stamp, were embracing it, found out that they were conservatives with a small c during this period. Maybe can you talk a little bit about that interpretation of what was going on then?
Yes, well, that was a very important period. I think it's generally recognized, and but examples of liberals who became conservatives with a small c would be my father and Sam Beer, two important people in my life. So yeah, it was no, and it's true too. That, by the way, that so the conservatism as a political movement in America was born at that time, out of reaction to the late 60s. Well, the late 60s was so you could say the center of it was in the universities. It wasn't only in America, of course, it was elsewhere as well. But it was an attack on the university for complicity in the war in Vietnam, and then that was broadened into an attack on science or political science or social science for its objectivity, its failure to raise the value question, its attempt to rely on science as a way of dodging responsibility for your results as a scientist. So this is what we now call postmodern. after modern, but without finding a new word to define it. There's an attack on modern, which means modern science, especially modern rationality, and headed in the direction of the affirmation or assertion of what your will declared to be a value. So that one could say is the sort of more philosophical meaning of it. One thing it meant immediately was a great grade inflation that occurred in the universities, and particularly in Harvard. And that was something I reacted against, and I got a name for, and still have it, for being an enemy of grade inflation. It was an attack on standards, on academic standards, mostly because, more directly because at the time, if you were in college, you could be drafted and sent to Vietnam if your grades were in the lower half of your class, or some such metric as that. So all the professors, who were almost all opposed to the war in Vietnam, indulged in grade inflation. Another thing that was happening at the same time was a large number of Black students being brought into universities, and particularly at Harvard. And nobody wanted to welcome a Black student by giving him a C. So the grade C, if you weren't going to give a Black student a C, then you couldn't do it for whites either. So the grade C became disused. And so that is great inflation, and also a certain self-loathing, and more than an apology, but actually a loathing of your country. And the radicals of the late 60s were really cheering for the Viet Cong to win in Vietnam. Those were the communists, the other side in the Cold War. Not people that you would expect Americans wanting to associate with. So, all this began something which I think continued later, when the radicals students who rebelled became professors themselves, tenured radicals, to use a phrase that was used. And today you see it in so-called woke. The assertion that universities are systemically racist, institutions of white supremacy, and deserve to be attacked and taken over by those who, you could say, themselves profit from white supremacy, but at least are opposed to it, and they look for it and find it everywhere. So this excuses them from being white and still therefore somehow supreme. Anyway, so that was a very significant period, and it did have a lasting political influence. Changed the character of the left. It changed it from Marxism, which was rational and philosophical, which had explanations, which had science. Stalin thought he was a much smarter person than Hitler, because Hitler had racist prejudice, and Stalin, had Marxist science. That was a feature in it. All right, so, and now Marxism now fell to the level of a kind of nihilism, a kind of Nietzschean consciousness raising, that in which Marxism as a science became an affirmation of value without any scientific basis, indeed against any scientific basis. So
when you were living through this period, because at this time you were a professor in Harvard, and as we know, there were certain notable people in Harvard at the time. I'm thinking Timothy Leary. You had people like that. Now, where were you positioned intellectually and politically even before the late 60s happened? Did this come as a surprise to you, or were you kind of half expecting it?
No, I was not half expecting it. It was definitely a surprise to me.
Okay.
Yeah. And to most others, including those who were in favor of it. Yes, drugs was also an aspect of it. That it was a good idea to drug your brain. If your reason didn't mean anything, why not look for another level of consciousness beyond rationality?
And you were saying that this development had a lasting impact, which you believe is still felt today through wokeism and other movements. How did it feel at the time? I mean, did you feel this was a temporary blip, or did you sense that there was something more profound happening here?
Oh, I think the latter. I think most people thought the latter too. It was not thought to be just a passing fancy. The whole university divided. The majority were in favor of the 60s rebellion, but a substantial number were opposed. And just as a matter of collegiality, everybody knew what side you were on. And that lasted for as long as decades. And people came together afterwards, but not in the same way as before. Also the comedy between students and professors was much changed for the worse. Professors used to dine with students, talk with them informally, much more than they do now. So I've seen that very much in the way that Harvard is ordered and goes on.
Were you, I mean, did you find yourself therefore in a minority after this within Harvard, within the politics department, or more broadly intellectually in Harvard from the 70s onwards, or were you a sizable minority, or where did you play in the spectrum?
Well, it depends on what you meant, what you're referring to. If you're just referring to academic collegiality and believing in upholding academic standards, I was in a sizable minority. And in fact, I was made chairman of the department in the early 70s. So that wouldn't have happened if I had been in the insignificant minority that I later became. But being a Straussian was not, that is not a majority position. That is, yeah, just from what I said so far to explain it, you can see that it's not something that most people are going to be immediately attracted to. That's one of the good things, by the way, about Arthur Melzer's book on Strauss, which is that he gives all the reasons why, and understandable reasons why people are suspicious of this way of reading texts. So I've always been in a small minority as a Straussian, but as a conservative, say, a much larger minority, but now increasingly diminished. So that some people have actually said, I'm the last conservative at Harvard. That isn't quite true. but it's as if it were true.
Mm. Well, just to close out this particular episode, I mean, towards the end of the 1970s, you wrote this book called The Spirit of Liberalism.
Yeah.
And my reading of that is you while you may have become a supporter, you may have become a conservative in name.
Mhm.
My reading of you were kind of a liberal of the old order.
Yeah.
But you felt that old liberalism lost its nerve.
Yes.
Is that the correct interpretation? And if that's the case, did you feel the 1970s was the decade old liberalism lost its nerve?
Yes, that's an historical question. I'm not quite so sure, but yes, but that is the meaning of my book. Yeah. The loss of the sense that a liberal is somebody who defends liberty. That is not what it means now. But it is what it used to mean. So if you asked me what conservatism is today, I would say it is defending liberalism against the people who are called liberals.
Yes. So there's this distinction between liberal society and the liberal state. You've made that distinction another way as well.
Yeah. A liberal in the older sense is somebody who defends liberalism or defends liberty, who sees or believes that you must stand up for your rights, that you can't expect somebody else to give them to you, because to have a right is to be living on the premise that you deserve that right, and you would deserve it because you're capable of upholding it. So there's a spiritedness, to use a Platonic term, which I haven't used yet, a thumos behind liberty. Self-preservation won't preserve itself unless it defends itself. So the Lockean and Hobbesian phrase self-preservation needs to be understood in a spirited, defensive way in order to make itself come true.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'd now like to move to a book, if you like, a book you wrote called A Student's Guide to Political Philosophy, which on one level it's a nice simple book, but on another level it's full of provocations, I thought, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's actually it's a deeper book than it presents itself as. Let me put it that way. So I'd like maybe to talk about your interpretation of political philosophy and the great tradition of political philosophy, using that book as a kind of a platform, if you like. So my first question is, in that book you kind of interpret political philosophy and politics through the lens of partisanship.
Yeah.
So can you explain, first of all, why you use that lens for that book?
Yes, partisanship. Argument which extends your thinking, so you don't stay where you were, but you'll encounter another stage, an objection, which forces you to take another step in your thinking. This is dialectic. Maybe no one is there, but you're thinking yourself. You're playing objector to your own thinking. So even thinking by yourself is argument. You're anticipating or supposing what would happen when you're arguing. So you're not satisfied with what you have. There's something bothering you. You're not smug. You begin to question your own premises. So philosophy somehow comes out of politics. In politics, there's a limit to how much you can question yourself. You have to have a position, and you can't always be qualifying or rethinking that position while you're defending it. So in a way, political argument is opposed to philosophical argument, because political argument limits how much you can question yourself, whereas philosophical argument centers on questioning yourself. But the two are connected in that they're both argument. What does a politician do every day or anyone who's interested in politics, thinks about, say, you go to the internet, you surf, and you see what the other side is saying, or what your side is saying, or what your side is denouncing the other side for saying. So that's what. So politics in this way has such great potential for philosophy, or for abandoning your position, your sense that you are for sure correct on this, and looking at it again. Let's have another look at it. That's a philosophical way of thinking. And then usually another look at the text, because the texts help you. The texts give you arguments. The great philosophers, the great books disagree. So if I were to tell you, which I do, I think in that pamphlet, by the way, you're inflating it to call it a book, but it's a pamphlet advising how to study political philosophy. So you could you can find it out of politics in this way. The great books are not solutions. They're clarified questions or clarified disagreements. They teach you that there aren't 1,001 goals, as Nietzsche said that there are 1,001 values. No, not that many. There are several. You can pretty much identify these several ways of fundamentally different ways of thinking, and identify them with great books. But it isn't. You don't come up with answers or for sure solutions. You come up with maybe affirmations or assertions even. This is as far as I think reason can go to support what you might think, what you're now asserting. So that may be short of a full proof, but it's what you think / assert. And so that's not mere assertion, but it's thoughtful assertion. I think that's that's what maybe you could, the goal you could hope for when you read the great books, which are the source of the greatest ideas. There's an unbelievable inequality in the human mind. From Aristotle or Hegel, let's take an ancient and a modern, down to a moron. That's almost incredible, that degree of the different ways in which the top and the bottom live, and yet they're somehow both human. You have to get up to as far as you can get toward the top, and never forgetting that there are people at the bottom as well.
Just while we're on this particular topic, where do you stand on? I mean, it sounds to me when reading your interpretation of the great tradition that there is something timeless going on here. There's a kind of a timeless conversation of humanity. And that, political philosophy at its best it brings that to the highest level of rational argument. But there's always going to be this disagreement. Whereas in politics, there's probably less reason and more argument, if you like, more emotion. So if that's correct, what do you take? How do you regard those who think that there's no such thing as this timeless conversation? That history is the story of discontinuity, not continuity, and that we just have a series of breaks, and that one tradition is incommensurable with the other tradition, that they don't talk, that we have these paradigm shifts, and there is no continuity, and to suggest there is an illusion.
I would say yes, there are breaks, but the breaks are at the highest level rationalized, or made rational, or made intelligible, and so this view of Thomas Kuhn that science consists in a succession of paradigms, one conquering the next. That in a way that's correct, or it has a lot of truth in it. But I think Galileo could give reasons for making the break that he made and proposing a new mathematical physics, and you can study them. So I think I would deny that that there's a total loss of continuity. The philosophers do speak to each other much more than is apparent. That's one of the main things, or perhaps the main thing, that you learn from understanding esoterically. Esoterically, they are speaking to each other. I think, as regards Machiavelli, I don't want to ruin your schedule, but I think had a very strong notion of the successors to his thinking, which would maybe disagree with it in aspects, but fundamentally carry it on. And this would be modernity, modern philosophy. It has a certain unity that you don't quite see in the ancients, and who are really more diverse than the moderns.
Just before we go into your views about ancient Christian and modern political thought, something I would like to ask you about is that, well, and it's got two sides to it. One is, to do political philosophy, you have to study the history of political philosophy. And for a lot of people, that wouldn't be intuitive, because you could study chemistry without having to study the history of chemistry or whatever. So I'd like you maybe to talk about that, and also maybe touch upon the fact that political science, in that kind of very empirical, data-driven form, doesn't think it has to look at the history of political science. It can kind of live in the constant presence and be perfectly respectable, and can avoid partisanship. So maybe could you talk about those two aspects?
Well, science versus humanism. Yeah. Science is rational. it supposes that everything is intelligible, but it can't explain why people reject science, as we saw during the COVID experience, and why people think that they might be threatened by science or by people who are more intelligent than they. Science doesn't understand the power of unreason. And it can't even give an explanation of itself. What is the scientific reason in favor of science? It's there isn't any. So if you begin from this kind of unreasoning suspicion of science, you begin to see the weakness of science in its inability to defend itself and to explain itself. Science works by mathematics. Very few people are mathematically capable. I'm not, for example. And so science, in order to explain itself, needs to somehow express itself in non-science. It's not very good at doing that. It needs publicists to do that. So it needs people like Dr. Fauci in America, who was a scientist who defended science or defended the measures taken against COVID, and not very successfully, or at least not fully successfully. So that you need rhetoric, you could say, rhetoric which appeals to the irrational side of the human mind, or the mix of rationality and irrationality that characterizes the human being. And so to learn that, you have to go to the poets, or to the humanists, or to the philosophers. And so that politics sort of stands in between science and humanism. And you see that in my government department at Harvard, that half of them, or a little bit more than half, are quantitative types who do mathematical political science, and the other half aren't, who are somehow dissatisfied. They aren't very good at explaining themselves either. But they're in some way humanists. They have to live with their suspicions and somehow express them. So I think this is still the case, that science can be totally occupied with the latest science in a way that you're hardly aware of what went on a decade ago. And you don't have to study that. And it would be a waste of time to do that. But on the other hand, the way in which science is understood, the way in which, in its own history, it has gone from a totally confident desire to conquer nature to, in Bacon, say, early 17th century, to Francis Bacon, or to today, science is cleaning up for the pollution of science. all the issues relating to climate. Because the concern about our climate is really a concern about science. It's a concern about technology, but technology is based on science. So, and we're hoping for a scientific resolution to the problems of science. But maybe that's not possible, or maybe that doesn't fully work. Well, the questioning of science is, you see both on the left with its environmentalism, and on the right with its doubts about stem cell research and such matters. So science itself has to face its own career of sort of shining promise to full of doubt about itself, if it's really aware of what's going on. And I think most scientists are aware of these things. One characteristic of modern science, as opposed to ancient science, is that modern science is tremendously expensive. It's a laboratory thing. And at our university, I'm sure it's true of yours too, you couldn't do modern science without extensive support from the government. No university can be totally private for that reason today. So, but governments are elected by voters. So voters have to be convinced that science is good. And that's, so science does depend on this sort of humanistic concern for convincing people that something is good and something else is not so good, that science is good. If science doesn't have its own reason for that, then it needs to find reasons outside science. And it depends on those reasons. So
that's good. That gives a good answer to the first half. I think you've given it quite a good justification why science really can't just live in the present. It needs to be a bit more reflective about its past and about the bigger scope. I mean, its role in society, if you like. But if asked by a skeptic, well, Professor Mansfield, I'm come here to do political philosophy.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, we should just kick off at Rawls and work our way from there.
Yes, that's what most of them do today. That's a big mistake. Yeah. Well, because I think one could make the same statement about Rawls that I made about science, that he's in trouble too, and that he doesn't know where he stands. If you look at Rawls, there are two great crises in his life where he surrendered. And one was to the postmodern. So he surrendered to Richard Rorty and rewrote a theory of justice in his so-called political liberalism to answer the questions about confident philosophy or confident liberalism that were posed by Rorty. And he surrendered to Susan Oken, a feminist, that his whole theory was for males and not for women. So, I mean, I don't mean to take up against Rawls, whom I knew, of course, he was and was a very nice man and very nice to me too. But no, he's not the be all and end all of philosophy. And I think this was the main point of Strauss, that modern political philosophy had run itself into a rut, into the ditch, and couldn't justify itself any longer. And this is why it came to something that Nietzsche called nihilism. And that if the people who are in love with Rawls should be asked to read Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the outstanding modern, up-to-date, most up-to-date political philosopher. All those after Nietzsche who are sort of Nietzschean are followers of and explainers of Nietzsche. He defeated Marx. He turned Marxism, and as I was saying before, into a kind of Nietzschean value consciousness. And he's turned modern into postmodern. So so what Strauss tried to show is that it is possible to go back. And the great thing about the great works of humanism is we don't throw anything away. Right? If you buy your books as an undergraduate, and they're scientific books, that the decade or the year that you graduate, or at least a decade after you graduate, you can throw all those books away. You don't throw away Jane Austen or Shakespeare or Aeschylus or Sophocles or Plato.
Yes.
Those people, those people are still alive, and it's not just alive for philologists to study Greek and to study languages, but for people who want to learn the truth.
Yes, it is interesting about humanism, isn't it, that while there may not be a last word in the sense that there won't be a final text, the perfect work of philosophy, the perfect novel, the perfect poem, in the same breath, there is an enduringness about the great works. So they're not perfect, but they are enduring, which is kind of like, where you don't get that with science. Science almost leaves the past redundant, or, you can forget about it in a pragmatic way.
Yes. Yeah, they're not being perfect leaves you freedom.
Yes.
So you can do something of your own. You could be creative in a way that with science you can't.
Very good. I'd like now, maybe if we start the story a bit, and it would help us get to why you think Nietzsche is kind of like, everything after Nietzsche is really a footnote to modernity, you could say. But if we start with, because you believe that political philosophy began with Socrates. And so can you explain what he started, or what you think is significant about Socrates's, what he started?
Yeah. Well, what he started was not philosophy, but political philosophy. The pre-Socratics, as they're called, had started philosophy by making a distinction between what is nature and what is convention, or what is physis and what is nomos, to use the Greek words. So the physis is what is in itself, and that happens without human intervention. And nomos is what requires what human beings have done or agreed to. So the sacred cow, if it has an udder, the udder is natural, but the sacredness is added on by human beings. And so that they live with that distinction between nature and convention. And you could say what Socrates did was to question the completeness of that distinction, because people who make conventions, human beings, are also natural or have a nature. And so the conventions that they make are not totally separate from or distinct from their nature. If I can say their nature is to be able to make things artificially with arts and to think things up conventionally, make their own opinions of them. And so Socrates, to do this, to complicate the distinction between nature and convention, made his famous, well, it's called second sailing. The philosophy, instead of trying to just investigate nature directly, what is nature? Or what are the most natural sources of the things that we see? He decided that he would do it through opinions, because opinions have some truth in them. And that's why it's valuable, as I was saying before, to argue and to work out the truth in opinions. So that's his second sailing. He talks to people and gets their view of things. And in doing that, he focuses on the question of what is. So dialogue about courage. What is courage? And somebody says it's staying where you're put. And Socrates argues against that and said, but it has some truth in it. In a kind of more general or elevated way of saying the same thing is that opinions start with what is visible. And if you think about it or question it, you go to what is intelligible. So if you want to understand what a tree is, you look at it, the visible tree, and you try to see how the different parts of it, what are the parts, what are the whole of it, how are they connected, how are they put together so that it's one thing that has a what. And then you would define that. And that would be an intelligible version of what you've seen. So if you looked in a botany book, so the definition of a tree, that would be a complete or perfect tree that you've worked out from what you see. And so there's a way in which that perfect or intelligible tree in the botany book is more real as a tree than the visible trees that you're looking at. And that's how Plato could think that the ideas of a thing, the idea of a thing, the word he uses was eidos, which means shape or form, the shape of a tree. That to understand, you go from what is visible to what is intelligible. So this is connected to going from, well, what is opinion to what is knowledge. And so it means that the opinion is connected to what is visible, what most people think is most visible about a thing. So it's superficial to regard that as superficial. You should, that's what you should work from. So this is a kind of a general picture of what Socrates did.
Just when you're talking there about that, obviously the analogy of the cave asserts itself as a wonderful way of bringing that to life. And the fact that, many of us think that what's visible is all that's there, or putting it in the language of convention versus nature, all there is convention. In other words, there may be other caves, but the most important cave is the one I'm in. And also the fact that people aren't prepared to turn around and maybe see that there's natural light coming through. It's not just so. And again, it helps us get a purchase. You were saying there, I thought very interestingly, that Socrates, and you could say Plato, they don't go straight to the forms. They realize I've got to get a purchase here with these folks. Because if I talk about forms from the get-go, I'm going to lose everyone, or they're not going to believe me. Whereas you're saying he kind of starts in the foul rag and bone shop of our hearts, and works from there.
And the working from is what you just said, in which I omitted to say. the working is through an image.
Yes.
So the cave is an image of the idea of the good, in which we live. And so in Plato's Republic, you don't get arguments for the idea of the good, for the highest good, but rather you just get three images of it: the sun and the divided line and the cave. And and that's what you do when you go from a visible tree to an intelligible tree. You take an image of it and you look at that and see what it is. And so a human being has a nature. It's the only animal that can see an image. Other animals, say, if it sees an image, either is fooled by it. If a dog sees another plastic dog and thinks it either thinks that's a dog or it thinks it's plastic. It doesn't see it as an image of a dog.
Hmm.
And that goes together with the ability to count, because human beings are the only animals that can have images. We're able to count. If you go into a room and try to count the number of people, you have to find something that enables you to see what it is you're counting. Because each human being is going to be different in some major or slight way. And how can you say this is 10 when it seems like these are 10 totally diverse people? Well, the answer is you can make an image of a human being. And you can, so you know what a human being looks like. Yes. You take that, and then so you can count them up. And so you say these are 10 people. And so someone says, well, how many are men? How many are women? So you change. You go from an image of a human being which doesn't have a sex to a human being that does. But in both cases, there isn't any empirical or visible thing which exactly represents what you're counting.
Hmm. So, something that you mentioned, Harvey, that I think is relevant when we talk about Plato and Socrates, is that we started the conversation by talking about the centrality of argument, both in political philosophy and in politics. And when you look at all Plato's works, they're all in the form of a dialectic. Mm-hmm. It's like he really understood the essence of these things is about argument. Mm-hmm. And that adopting a treatise-like form is not conducive towards philosophical illumination.
Right.
Do you have any comment is that something that, in other words, that there may be a philosophical point to the dialectic as opposed to just a stylistic feature?
Yeah. Well, it is. That's looking at the truth through opinions about the truth. And you can write a treatise in such a way that you do that. That's what Aristotle did. He didn't have dialogues, but he does have different opinions. He looks at the same thing from different aspects, as this, and puts words in people's mouths, or this argument says that. So you can do it in the what looks like the form of a treatise, but it wouldn't be a sort of Euclidean geometry book.
No,
where everything is deduced and cannot be other than it is. So if you have a treatise which has contradictions, that's a sign of a great mind at work, forcing you to wonder, why does Locke say that man is the workmanship of God, and also say that man owns himself, that he owns his own body, i.e., not the property of God? So that's a contradiction. That's in a book which is called a treatise, second treatise of government, and the purpose is to teach you, to make you think. And it's not that one of those is necessarily true and the other false, but they may both represent some truth or some attempt at truth. So, and you can't say that Locke was such a fool as to leave a contradiction like that unrecognized.
And that's where the esoteric reading comes in, you're saying. We've talked there about Socrates, Harvey, and by extension Plato, and their way of kind of bringing political philosophy to life. What do you think Aristotle brings to the table, in addition to what they brought to the table?
I think the number one thing, the most obvious thing, would be moral virtue. Whereas Plato presents virtue as culminating in philosophy. And he's always comparing every secondary or subordinate virtue to philosophy and finding it inferior. And he ends up with a government by a philosopher king as the highest, as the peak. Whereas Aristotle is remarks on the very common experience we have that smart people are not always trustworthy, and that trustworthy people are not always smart. There's a certain realm of honesty, of moral virtue, virtues dealing with practical things. And that means especially with the fact that we inhabit human bodies, which make claims on us and force us to prefer ourselves and to improve ourselves, or to spend our lives concentrating on ourselves in a way that pure mind would not tolerate. So that I think is what you could say, and this leads to kind of the promotion of a politics of gentlemen, of people whom you can characterize as strong but gentle. Most gentle people are weak. They have to be gentle. But if you're strong, you don't have to be gentle. So it's your morality, your gentlemanliness, which makes you gentle. And that would be kind of an elementary political view of moral virtue. And then the relationship between moral virtue and intellectual virtue is difficult and full of trouble.
Okay.
But I think that's the main thing Aristotle would bring.
Okay, thank you. We're going to kind of do a fairly quick look at the tradition of political philosophy. And as everyone knows, the kind of textbook history, ancient political theory is succeeded by Christendom, which kind of brings us up to the Renaissance. So for a good 1500 years, you had Christianity contributing to this tradition. I mean, what do you think fundamentally, if anything, Christianity brought to the tradition, or other religious perspectives?
The whole challenge of to philosophy itself, as from human intelligence, unassisted human reason, to use the phrase of Thomas Aquinas, versus revelation, or Christian revelation, or divine law, which is revealed, comes from God, and it's not to be questioned, and it's mysterious. So, and there are central mysteries to Christianity. Where is God? Where is he? Is he in what he created, or is he above what he created, or what? And then in Christ, that a man, an actual human being, a living human being, could be God. So those are mysteries. So now, how does philosophy, unassisted human reason, make its way? Is it necessarily opposed, or can it come to some kind of agreement, some kind of compromise? And I think that was the main question of you might say the Christian period, or early and late Middle Ages, very generally stated. And and philosophy is still understood to be classical philosophy, or classical political philosophy, which means Socratic. But you mustn't forget there are other strains, Stoic and Epicurean. So ancient is not simply Socrates, but when you say the ancients versus the moderns, what you mean are the ancients that the moderns objected to, and that was the Socratics.
Okay, so as we say, we come to the Renaissance, and we come to Machiavelli, who really came to the forefront at the beginning of the 16th century with the publication of The Prince, and then following that, well, he wrote plays, and he also wrote the Discorsi on the first 10 books of Livy. But you see him as the founder of modernity, even if he himself didn't see him that way. I mean, it's kind of a rear view of Machiavelli. And you also talk about his identification of this effectual truth about politics. So maybe can you explain why you think Machiavelli is the founder of modernity, and what is this effectual truth you think he hits upon that's really central?
All right, good, because I finished a book called Machiavelli's Effectual Truth, in which I take up this phrase that he actually invented. Machiavelli is in, but not of, the Renaissance, I would say. Renaissance means rebirth, and the rebirth is the rebirth of the ancients, but Machiavelli took up against the ancients. And he does that especially in The Prince, and especially there in chapter 15, and especially in chapter 15, the first paragraph. And that's where he uses the phrase effectual truth, verità effettuale, the effectual truth of a thing as opposed to the imagination of it. That is, and the effectual truth of a thing is how it is, and the imagination of it is how it ought to be. And he rebels against this whole picture which I gave of Socratic philosophy, that you shouldn't look at a visible tree and try to make what is intelligible out of it, but you should look at the visible tree and see what comes out of it, the effect that you can get from it. So, for example, wood for a carpenter. That's an effect or a result of the truth of a tree. Truth of a tree is what you can make of it, or what. And it also is a come down, a reduction of high sounding phrases. So for Machiavelli, when somebody says to you, "I love you," the meaning of that, the effectual meaning of that is, the effectual truth of that is, I want something from you. And so he's trying to get the better of you in some way. So that word, or that phrase, effectual truth, occurs only once in all of Machiavelli's writings, in that first paragraph in chapter 15 of The Prince. And it doesn't occur anywhere in the history of philosophy that I've been able to discover. So I keep saying that in public, and no one has corrected me yet. Maybe it will happen. if you look at the biggest Italian dictionary, the Grande Dizionario, you see effettuality, the first use of it, that is Machiavelli. He seems to have used and most of the Italian editions of the Prince say nothing about this phrase, effectual truth, because there's no source for it. It leaves a scholar totally at a loss when there's no source for something. And yet, isn't it interesting that he could have invented this new phrase, right? Isn't that worth a little, worth something of a comment? One would think. So they say effettivo, or effective in English. Effective means you have the potential to give an effect, but effectual means you've actually given it, or it's actually come about. So I think that is kind of the ancestor of modern science, and it's what it means by causality and cause and effect. That you're not to be influenced by the imagination of things, but look at what actually comes out. So you disregard and discard Aristotle's final cause. It's not for any purpose. And formal cause, it's not because it has a certain form or something. But what is the effect? So the law of gravity, he said. And how do you see the law of gravity? Not by asking people's opinions, like Socrates. If you ask someone, they'll say, "Oh, the Earth moves, not the sun." I mean, the sun moves, not the Earth. Or a lump of lead falls faster than a feather. So what science does is try to remove human beings from their comfortable and average and normal surroundings, and put you in a vacuum. That's when you learn the law of gravity applies equally to the feather and to the lump of lead, or in a scientific laboratory, rather than looking at actual societies, or in what in Hobbes and Locke call the state of nature, which doesn't really exist, but is just posited. That's a kind of good imagination. Imagine to show you the nature of man. In other words, you look at the extreme instead of at the normal. So I think that's a statement of what Machiavelli does morally, and what modern science does to understand the operations of nature.
Now that is a more nuanced interpretation of Machiavelli than is common. I mean, the common interpretations of Machiavelli include he founded political science. He separated facts from values. Some people even say he separates morality from politics.
Yes.
Your interpretation doesn't commit you to those things. You think, no, it's a bit more loaded and even more radical than that. Maybe can you explain his originality in a way that shows it's not those things, it's something else?
Well, it's not a science with no morality, because it has a morality. As you said earlier, Machiavelli has a notion of virtue. It's just that it's a different notion. It's a kind of virtue which will make you dependent on no one. So it's a kind of virtue which looks to take advantage of other people. You can develop relations of trust with someone, but the purpose of building up trust is to be able to betray it, or to get advantage from betraying it when necessity arrives, and you're forced to do that in order to promote or defend yourself. So it's not no morality, but a new morality. And then as to fact, the word effect, the effectual, comes from facere in Latin, which does, the past participle is factum, would be the basis of our English word fact. Not many people, not many scientists know that the idea of fact was discovered. The Greeks don't speak of any such thing. For them, facts come and go. They're ephemeral. What is ephemeral isn't knowledge. Knowledge is what is permanent or eternal. That's knowledge. But as modern science, no, it's fact. Now, Machiavelli doesn't use the word fact, except in the old sense. The old sense was facere means to make or do. So it's what is made or done by a human being, or a deed. And so in the ancients, in Thucydides, for example, you get a distinction between speeches and deeds. But Machiavelli replaces that with a distinction between imagination, that's speech, and effect, that's deed. And so this leads to the language of fact, which you get in Hobbes. When we say anything is a fact, that a piece of paper, a book, your nose, anything is a fact. It isn't just a human deed. But that means it's an effect which can be studied, as opposed to a deed which can be or needs to be interpreted.
Mm.
There's a sense in which he anticipates the distinction between fact and value, but in a way that determines what a fact is. If you looked at the history of the fact-value distinction, you would see that at the beginning, it's all about fact, and at the end, today, it's all about value. And so what it is it's about understanding as nature in such a way that it can be understood as facts that either get in our way or facilitate us. And the most factual character of a fact is a stubborn fact. Facts are stubborn things. That's said by often said. A stubborn fact is not so. And so that the essence of a fact, the most factual fact, is the fact when it's an obstacle. It's something that gets in your way. So science is about how to deal with, get around, or somehow overcome or conquer the obstacles that get in our way. And therefore, that nature is not mostly friendly or intelligible to us, but rather it sets obstacles for us. Facts.
Yes, I mean, your reading of Machiavelli suggests that by taking kind of God out of the picture and the sacred out of the picture, we can now focus on stuff that we can't control, but we have a better chance of controlling when we kind of we take the transcendent out of the picture. And you kind of suggest this then becomes the overriding concern of modernity. Yeah. Either building on Machiavelli or in from a Hobbesian or Lockean point of view, or reacting against him from a Rousseauian point of view in some kind of way, a disenchantment with that. Can you say a little bit about this this new trend
of the conquest of nature?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a Baconian expression, conquering nature, and the way to do it is as he proposed, was to use nature against itself. So you use what is most powerful in a human being, this is in Hobbes and Locke, to overcome the obstacles that nature puts in our way. And what is most naturally powerful in us is the desire for self-preservation. And if we turn that desire into the basis of morality, that will give morality a new power and a new universality that it never had before. It's not just for gentlemen or for people who are able to be cultivated or have leisure, but it's for everybody. And it's effective because you'll always feel it and you'll always worry about it. And it has the power to interrupt your smugness or your routine or your calm or your comfort, and to force you to address it. So this is a thing which is very natural to us. It's also very extreme. It's only very few times in your life, unless you're a soldier or something, that your life is really at risk, that it's a life and death question for you. Well, maybe when you're driving a car and you could easily hit somebody else, but it doesn't look that way. But it has the power to take over your mind. And if it at the same time is the basis of morality, if you have a right to do this, the right to life, then that gives morality a new power and a new effectiveness. And so this is a kind of development of Machiavelli, because it has this power, but also a change because it returns morality to your thinking. And so Hobbes could talk about justice. Machiavelli rejects justice, or he just totally equates it with necessity. It's in Hobbes, no, there's justice again. That's right. So that appeals to our morality in a way that Machiavelli doesn't. Machiavelli appeals to our willingness to abandon morality, or to suddenly be impressed by a sensational, immoral event, or to like a politician like Donald Trump, who shocks you with his unconventional and unexpected things. So it regularizes morality in a way that Machiavelli didn't have, and Locke does that to a still greater extent. And Rousseau comes along, and he questions the whole idea of self-preservation. What is this self that is being preserved in self-preservation? And it's not something which can be taken for granted, that you know what yourself is. No, you don't. And the earliest human beings didn't have a self, or weren't aware of it, or had what they had was a natural goodness that was almost at the level of animal awareness, not thought out in any way. So there's actually a history of the self that goes from primitivism through the noble savage and to sophisticated and corrupt civilization, and the self therefore has a history. So when I teach modern political philosophy, I teach Rousseau as a kind of linchpin from talking about nature, human nature, to talking about history, or the human history. So this is what I think Rousseau introduces and adds. He radicalizes Hobbes and Locke and Machiavelli, because he shows that it isn't as rational or as prudent as they think.
That's interesting what you say there about Rousseau. I mean, do you see Rousseau then as almost the historical turn before Hegel, by showing how our sense of self has changed? It's not a static entity.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. And even in Kant, too, you see the great student of Rousseau. Yeah. The historical development through progress, through factual progress of that makes perpetual peace possible, especially in his essay, Kant's essay on perpetual peace. So you see this Rousseauian history, pre-Hegelian history at work.
Yeah, and what's interesting about, well, probably more about Rousseau and Hegel is, if you ditch the Geist in Hegel, or the sense we're culminating towards a telos, that history is the story of wins and losses. It's not a story of cumulative gain. We win, we gain certain things, but we lose certain things. And of course, that goes against the grain of a lot of political ideologies. But actually, that, I think, in a way, brings us in a way to someone you have written a fair bit about, and that's Tocqueville. And I wouldn't mind hearing what really impresses you about him. The thing I loved about your book on Tocqueville is you show that, well, I think something comes out really clearly is that you hone in on his observational insights as opposed to his concern with philosophical rigor. And that this, he thinks, is really important, especially for political philosophy and politics generally.
Well, I do think, and I've come to think, that he has philosophical rigor, but in an unrigorous way, in a way which doesn't make the rigor obvious. But setting that aside, he calls himself a new kind of liberal, and I think what that means is a new kind of liberal which is more attentive to some of the truths of ancient political philosophy. So he speaks of self and self-interest, but he also speaks of the soul. And the original liberals, the modern liberals, had replaced the soul with the self. I mean, they too, Descartes still use the word soul, but in general, this is, I think, a book by Charles Taylor on the sources of the self. And so Tocqueville comes back to the soul, and its full complement. It's concerned with the infinite. It's concerned with the best. It's concerned with mortality. All these things which are diminished or suppressed in the liberal, otherwise liberal self. And he worries right at the beginning, in the introduction to Democracy in America, about degraded souls. Democracy degrades souls. This is especially in Europe. And so he's come to America to show Europe that America is ahead. When you come to America, you're not investigating how European civilization is practiced in a wilderness. It's the other way around. America is ahead of Europe So he totally lacks that hauteur that say Chateaubriand, his distant relative, had in coming to America, and tries to teach America to Europe. And one of the things would be the recovery of the soul. And the other more general statement would be that democracy needs to understand itself as a whole that includes aspects of aristocracy, and then owes its vitality to democratized versions of aristocracy. So lawyers keep our sense of law and our sense of rights alive. And that sense doesn't come from liberal philosophy, according to Tocqueville, but it comes from the willingness of nobles to stand up to the king. The Middle Ages, religion. Religion he understands as an aristocratic influence. Religion is good because it combats democracy's tendency toward materialism, towards immediate pleasures, things that are right in front of you. And women too. Women, the American woman, he praises to the skies, more manly than American men, more responsible for our virtue than the men. And this is because they bind themselves, or willingly bond themselves in marriage after an education, a totally free education, as girls. And as girls, they're allowed to be to understand what the world is like, not to practice it, but certainly not educated in convents. But as wives, they know what the temptations of the world are, but they manfully oppose those or suppress those and get married to these rather somewhat boring, unerotic American men who are too interested in money to pay sufficient court to their beautiful wives.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Harvey. What I'd like now to go is the last kind of section of our interview. And I've just a few questions really about Harvard. As we touched on, you spent over 60 years there. With the man of your distinction, you probably had choices to go to other universities if you wanted to. So, assuming you had those choices, what has kept you at Harvard? What's drawn you there?
Actually, I didn't have those choices, and you're forgetting that I'm a Straussian.
Okay.
And Straussians don't have that many choices or that many awards. I have never had an award of any kind from a professional association or from Harvard either. I've had certain awards in my life, but they've all come from conservative organizations or conservative presidents, not from the university. I'm not complaining, but it's a fact of my life. So, but what I've seen at Harvard is, it's prestige, that's its strength, its wealth, its desire to be number one. We've got a new president just appointed. Her main task is to keep Harvard number one. I think that's pretty clear. But it's it's really abandoned veritas for mobilitas or change. If you ask what higher education is about, it's about adjusting to change. It's not about, indeed, our just appointed president says she rejected the notion of ivory tower or detachment, saying Harvard should not be alongside society, it should be a part of it. See, well, that's this very Machiavellian notion that the purpose of the intellect is to improve society, not to understand. And, I think that's really quite bad. It makes us trendy, and it has made us woke. So we recently had a report on Harvard's legacy of slavery. This is 150 pages or so, which consisted of various reminders that when Harvard existed, America had slavery. I think that it ends with the lie that Harvard could be defined as having a legacy of slavery. Right? I think that's really very wrong. And it illustrates the self-loathing which Harvard and present-day liberals have come to. Harvard has a large building called Memorial Hall, and that's a memorial to the Harvard graduates who died in the Civil War on the Union side. The names are all listed, and the list does not include those who died as Confederates. There were a few. So that's Harvard's legacy of anti-slavery. And I think that's the true definition of it. So I'm pretty upset at what has happened there.
Interesting. Because what I know of, for example, of Leo Strauss's old university, Chicago, it doesn't engage in that, or traditionally hasn't. It does see itself as a place of the intellect, which may or may not serve society, but it really doesn't care.
Yeah. Well, that is true of the University of Chicago. That was due to its president, Robert M. Hutchins. And not Strauss liked that about the University of Chicago, but I couldn't claim that he was the cause of it.
Yeah. But do you think a Straussian is happier in a University of Chicago-like environment compared to a contemporary Harvard?
Yes. That's right.
Okay. Finally, just broadening the perspective beyond Harvard. I mean, when you look at America today, especially on a political level, what worries you? What inspires you?
What inspires me is the continuity. We've kept our republic. I do not think it is any great danger, either from left or right. I am a conservative Republican, but I'm willing to lose elections, unlike Donald Trump. And then I think our Constitution is still alive and still operative. There are many who speak against it, but they do so really more in the context of the Constitution rather than as against it as they seem to be. So they take it for granted in opposing it, put it that way. They take its liberties and even its major institutions for granted. But hyperpartisanship is certainly a fact and a problem. leads to a lot of incivility, and in Donald Trump's attempted rejection of his lost election a couple of years ago. But there was no, I think, danger that that would succeed. And even his own people opposed it. That's one of the interesting facts that's come out in the hearings and investigations which have taken place since then. If you look at the last half century or even longer, you see that the two parties are pretty even. That it's about 50-50 in support and also in winning elections. So they both have the experience of winning and of losing. And I think that means that every election is close. And that means that, which means further that each party thinks it can win. And so it's as an incentive to exaggerate the importance of the election, since it might win and needs to get its base out. That's this. To gain a majority is now thought to mean rousing the people who are already in your favor to vote, rather than compromising your extreme positions in order to gain people in the middle. So those are the factors I was thinking in regard to the hyperpartisanship. There's Yuval Levin, I think was a writer at American Enterprise Institute, has made, I think, a very good remark about this, that you can divide the issues into cultural issues like abortion and economic issues like taxation. And the conservatives are worried that they're losing the cultural issue because they're more interested in the cultural issue than in the economic issue where they're winning. And the liberals are more worried that they're losing the economic issue because they're more interested in that than in the cultural issue where they're winning. But neither side is winning altogether. Capitalism is still strong, and the woke is also still strong for the liberal side. So, I would like to see less woke and about the same degree of capitalism or free market. So that makes me a center-right, say Republican, conservative Republican.
So therefore, politically unbalanced, the fact that you feel that each party has a chance of winning is a sign of the Republic's health.
Yes, yeah. It's a sign of high temperature, but also of health.
Okay, thank you. I finished my interviews by asking my guests a kind of a desert island question, imagining that they were to be left on a desert island forever. What piece of music, what book, and what luxury they would bring with them. So, if faced with that situation, what would you bring with you? If you could only bring one piece of music, one book, and a luxury.
Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, Plato's Republic, and Gulliver's Travels.
Okay, very good. So your luxury is another book. And an Irishman's book as well. Well, thank you very much, Harvey. Really appreciated our conversation. And it was lovely talking to you.
Good talking to you. Yes, a pleasure.
us